Good afternoon to everyone. Hope you enjoyed the festival so far. I'm Alessia Marrazzo from Lear, and I'll be chairing this session on detection of killer acquisition. So first of all, let me introduce the panel. We have Marta Rocha, Senior Economist at the Studies and Market Monitoring Bureau of the Portuguese Competition Authority. Then we have Fabian Paper, that is Head of German and European Merger Control Department at the General Policy Division of the German Competition Authority. And we have Carmine Ornaghi, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Southampton. Well, killer acquisition. This is a topic that has been at the center of antitrust debates for the last years, but still we believe that some questions remained unanswered. And that's the reason why we put together this panel that mixes different expertise, law and economic background with the aim of advancing the discussion on killer acquisition. And we would like to discuss three specific questions. The first one, how can we empirically measure killer acquisition? The second one, how can we effectively catch them? And the third and final one, what's beyond killer acquisition, especially in digital markets? So let's go into the details of the discussion, and let's start with the first question on the measurement. And Carmine, I know that you will cite a recent paper that has attempted to identify killer acquisition in the pharmaceutical industry. What are the challenges that the authors have encountered, and how would you propose to solve them?
Okay. Thank you, Alessia, for inviting me. And I need to start with an apology because apparently I'm the only one that prepared the slides. So usually I go to conference and everybody has slides, and so far I'm the only one. There is a reason because there are only 5 slides, so that's good news. There is a reason because the last one will be a picture. And as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think it's an interesting picture. So I will start, as Alessia mentioned, by commenting, referring to the famous article by Colleen Cunningham and co-authors recently published on GP about killers acquisition. And essentially, what they find are 3 or 4 important things. Obviously, the first thing is that acquired drug projects are less likely to be developed when there is an overlapping with the portfolio of the acquiring company. And this result is stronger in some circumstances. The first one is when the acquiring company has a strong market power, meaning that he has already a product in the market with a large market share. And second, when patent expiration is in the distant future. Obviously, there has been research in the past that is showing that the incentive of a company, obviously when you are close to patent expiration, is the opposite, is to introduce a new product in order to maintain that market power. So here we are kind of in an opposite situation where here the incentive is actually to kill the competition, or at least apparently. What they find is that about 5 to 7% of the acquisitions can be considered killer acquisitions. And those overlapping between the acquirer and the target is more likely when you are just below the threshold to which these deals need to be notified to the competition authorities. And then there are other results relating more to this idea that mergers are important and relevant if you look at efficiency because of synergies, because the acquirer and the target can talk to each other, can do things better. But actually what they find is that there is no evidence that the acquiring company actually cite the work of the target company, and quite worryingly, it's quite challenging the fact that about only 22% of the inventors keep working for the acquiring company. And I will go back to this number here in slide number 4, I think. So, first of all, do intention matter? And here, essentially, it's interesting the way that the authors try to sell their, or they present their work quite strong. They say that this incumbent firm acquires the target solely to discontinue the target's innovation project and preempt future competition. So here we are talking about what I describe as first-degree murder. Why? Because there is the intention to kill here. Now, this idea that there is overlapping, and because of the overlapping, essentially, some of these projects are killed is not new. Indeed, here I cite a work which is by no means the only one, in 2013 by two important scholars in the area of pharmaceutical, where they say that when a merger occurs, it is common for managers to analyze the R&D portfolios of the combined companies and eliminate those that they see as duplicative. Here, the intention, there is no intention, essentially. They merge, they realize that there is overlapping, and you know what, we need to save on costs, then we kill what we think are duplicative. Now, does it matter? So here what I describe as a third-degree murder, because there is no the intention at the beginning, I just realized that there is overlapping and I want to save on the costs. Now, no, the answer is that it doesn't matter because merger control enforcement should restrain transaction with either the intent or the effect of reducing innovation, which is detrimental to future competition. Now, let me, given that the question, coming to the specific question that Alessia asked about measurement, let me give you just a few details about how they measure this killer acquisition. So there, they have this econometric model where you have a variable on the left and you try to put in relation with a variable on the right. The variable on the left is not termination, so it's not killing, but is actually development. Why? Because it's very difficult to observe termination of a project. So what they do is to say, oh, let me measure whether there are developments of the project. And developments are defined in a very broad sense. So you can see here on the right what they measure with development. It can be many different things. For instance, additional launches, or for instance, new licenses, and so on. So every time they observe one of those, their dependent variable takes value 1. And they say, oh, there has been a development of drug E in period T. And then they put this variable in relation or try to establish some causality with the fact that the acquirer and the target have overlapping. So the most important part here is this overlap, the fact that the target and the acquirer have overlapping technology. And here with overlapping, related again to the question that Alessia asked, is measured both in terms of therapeutic indication, but also in terms of modes of action, okay? So they notice that when there is overlapping, again, in therapeutic indication and in modes of action, they observe that the probability of development is lower. So they don't find that the probability of killing is higher when there is overlapping. What they find, given that they can observe termination and discontinuation, what they find is that when there is overlapping, the probability of development is lower. On this point, I, again, should notice that it's kind of well known that, at least among big mergers and acquisition, that in the period around the mergers, there are frictions, there are problems, and so that the development of some projects can be delayed. And in this is perfectly compatible with this framework because, I repeat, it's not about terminating a project, it's simply that you don't observe development. So if you have a delay, this is perfectly compatible with the results. Okay? Now, given again we are talking about killers, and so it's a crime scene investigation, as obvious, we need more evidence. Let me say that clearly this is a fantastic paper. Not only, there are at least other two papers that have collaborated, or studies more than papers, that have corroborated, confirmed the results of Colleen and Cunningham and co-authors. There is a study which was commissioned by DG Research in collaboration with DG Comp in 2018. I think it was done by Informa, which essentially found the same results, so that indeed the higher the overlapping, the less likely that you find a development. And there is this other article that is not published, as far as I know, by Karim and Mederer in 2019. And this is quite interesting because what they find indeed is that merging firms change development trajectory significantly more compared to their non-merging rivals. And they have the tendency to invest less in fields in which they overlap and tend to invest more in new but related fields. So what do they find is the following. Yes, if there is overlapping, it's less likely that I develop a project, but what they find is that if there is overlapping, it's more likely that I develop a project that is related. So it's not exactly the same drug, but it's in a field that is related. Now, remember what I mentioned, there is a recent article by Malek and other co-authors where essentially they look at specifically to the antidiabetic drug development, and they look at who buys whom, when they buy, so whether these acquisitions take place either early in the development stage, even preclinical sometimes, or in phase 1, or later on, like phase 2 and phase 3, and what type of technologies are bought. And what they find is pictures that is not necessarily the same, or a richer and more complicated picture than the one that is in the killer acquisition paper. Finally, before introducing the last slide with the picture that I mentioned at the beginning, let me say that one of the discussions is clearly not only killing a project, okay, which is clearly per se very, very important, not that it's not, but also what about the human capital that is behind that, okay? Because there are a number of people that work on this, and what we know is that mergers and acquisition reduce R&D investments, they reduce patenting, so more on the R side than the D side, so more on the research side than the development side. And on this, was just to point out that I do believe that the figures that they present in this mergers and acquisition paper are wrong substantially, because it's actually the opposite. So they claim that 22% of the inventors stay in the acquiring firms, and there are other works. And here I cite the work by Luca Verginieri and co-authors, where they find that 20% leave, and work that I'm also doing with other people, where I find similar numbers to the one of Verginieri, so that the probability of leaving or exiting is about 10–20%. So it's not as dramatic as in the Cunningham paper. So the last slide. Again, some crime statistics. And in this picture, what you see is new drugs that have been approved by the FDA in the United States in the last decade, between 2009 and 2018. So what we notice is that there is a general positive trend in the number of new drugs that have been approved. So this is good news. While back 20 years ago, there was a concern that the number of new drugs approval went down, now in the last, at least in the 10 years covered by these statistics, the number is going up. And the second interesting aspect, as you can see, is that the contribution of big pharma is pretty much stable. So it was 8, 7, 9, 9, pretty much stable. That means that of these new drugs, the originator was a big pharmaceutical company, only in 8, 7, 9, again, 8 cases. While the originator was a small lab, at the beginning, again, 8 or 9, so the same number as the big companies. But nowadays, you can see 22, 27, 35. Now, 2016 seems a bit of an outlier in that respect. So it means that in many, many cases, the originator was a small lab. So, two final considerations. The first one, so do we need to worry? So what the killer acquisition paper is telling us is essentially, yes, doesn't look bad, but what about the counterfactual? And the counterfactual is that, the situation could be even better. That is, we could have even more new drugs and we have new treatments for patients. So there is a general feeling that there has been a bit of under-enforcement in this direction. So essentially there are no many, or probably zero, mergers that in health that has been blocked. Just a few remedies that have been imposed. The problem, and I might agree with clearly with this under-enforcement, because if the number is zero, you cannot do less than zero, obviously. But at the same time, the picture is more complex to the extent that we don't know what will happen about the incentive of this lab, because it's clear that they cannot take their products to the market. It's very clear that they need to partner with these big companies in order to do all these very expensive clinical trials. So what will happen? There are incentives to, to innovate. It's not totally clear. And yes, I think I can stop so for other questions, maybe later.
Thank you, Carmine. Thanks a lot. Let's move now to the second question, that is, how can we effectively catch killer acquisition? So there are many that ask for complementing the existing threshold by additional notification requirements. And Germany has been implementing additional threshold based on the value of the transaction since 2017. But there is also this study, the staff working document, very recent, released by the European Commission, which has monitored the application of such threshold, that has concluded that they have not been able as yet to capture additional transaction. And at the same time, there has been a shift in the approach related to the application of the referral mechanism under Article 22 of merger regulation, which basically led to the very recent decision in Lumina Grill. So, Fabian, the question that I have for you, which of the two tools you believe are more effective, if any?
Okay, thank you, Alessia, and thank you for having me here. I wanted to apologize because I also have some slides. And finally, the target needs to have substantial operations in Germany. In 2016, 2017, when the introduction of this new threshold was discussed, there was some discussions on the legal certainty. It was said that the calculation of the consideration might be difficult. It turned out that's not really a problem. Another question that was discussed was if the concept of substantial operations in Germany is clear enough. And indeed, there have been some discussions with the parties whether this threshold is met or not. In order to give the parties some more guidance, Germany and Austria have published a joint guidance on the transaction value thresholds. Austria, more or less at the same time, introduced a very similar provision, which has similar conditions. One difference being that in Austrian law, the consideration needs to be above 200 and not above 400 million as in Germany. 2021, there has been an evaluation of the new provision, and the federal government produced a brief report on that. So going to the case experience in Germany, as a lawyer, I thought the first point, relatively few cases, is an interesting information, but I have been warned by my economist co-panelist that that is not a real statistic. So I will give you some figures. In the first 3 years and 9 months of where the new provision was in force, we have had 34 informal consultations. we have had 29. We have had 29 notifications. Out of these 29 cases, in 10 cases, we told the parties that, in fact, the case was not notifiable because the criterion of substantial domestic activity of the target was not met, and in those 10 cases, the parties decided to withdraw the notification. The other 19 cases have been cleared without conditions. As I said, calculation of transaction value has not been problematic. So what are the relevant industries? As expected, most of the cases were in the pharmaceutical sector. We have had there 14 cases. We have had 4 cases in the IT sector, but also we have had some cases in traditional industries. One thing that was not intended was that some cases were in the real estate sector, where cases where a big building that was not yet finished, i.e. that not yet generated any turnover, was sold to at a high price to another investor. Those cases were caught also. No killer acquisition detected so far in Germany, i.e. we have had no case, no intervention case, or no case where second phase needed to be initiated. I stress in Germany, in Austria, they have had, as far as I know, one case that was a Meta-Giffey case where the competition authority challenged the case before the court, and the cartel court then at the end cleared the case with remedies, and that was confirmed by the Supreme Court of Austria. One other piece of information that I would like to give you is that the transaction value threshold can also serve as a base for a referral based on Article 4.5 EUMR. Based on this provision, a company can decide to notify a case, to ask for a referral if the case is notifiable in 3 EU member states, and there have been a number of cases where the company said this case is notifiable in Germany because of the turnover value threshold plus in 2 other countries. One interesting case we have had is a Meta customer case. That case was notified in Austria based on their turnover thresholds, and so it was notifiable, and it was referred to the European Commission based on the so-called traditional approach. The Bundeskartellamt had, and the other competition and national competition authorities had 15 working days to decide whether they would join the referral or not. But in this case, the question whether customer, the target company, was active in Germany to a significant extent was difficult to assess, so we could not assess it in this case. So we decided to open an administrative procedure, which ended in a declaratory decision establishing the jurisdiction of the Bundeskartellamt, and therefore the necessity for the companies to notify the case. That decision was appealed by Meta, and the appeal is still pending. In substance, after the notification, we cleared the case. I will now come to the European approach, which is Article 22. As many of you probably know, there are several conditions for a referral from a member state to the Commission. It needs to be a merger within the meaning of the EUMR with no EU dimension. but which affects the trade between member states and threatens to significantly affect competition within the territory of the referring member states. Previously, the policy of the Commission was to discourage such a notification if the case is not notifiable in the referring member states. Now, on the contrary, if it is a good candidate case, referral is encouraged by the European Commission, even if it is not notifiable in any member state. And you probably all have heard about the Illumina Grail case, which was referred to the Commission by France. Some other EU and EEA member states joined the referral, and at the end, it was prohibited by the European Commission. So these are two approaches to get, to catch, to assess, to assert the jurisdiction over cases which do not fall under the traditional turnover-based thresholds. I think both approaches have pros and cons. The EU approach, in fact, is an effective and flexible means to call in basically all those cases below the thresholds which fulfill the conditions and that are prima facie considered good cases for a referral, but only those cases and not other cases. One downside of this Article 22 referral system is that the Commission gains jurisdiction only for those member states who have referred or joined the referral. In many digital cases or pharmaceutical cases, that is not really relevant if the markets are EEA-wide or worldwide, but they can be relevant if national markets are relevant. On the other hand, the new approach by the Commission is a departure from the principle that there should be a parallel between the notifiability and the reviewability by the competition authority. And if, as the Commission does here, you deviate from this parallelism, then that can cause doubts with regard to the legal certainty. And we hear from companies and from the lawyers that, in fact, that is an issue because they have, in many cases, which are clearly not notifiable, they have to make a preliminary assessment in order to know if they have to contact the Commission for some guidance to ask them if this is a good candidate case which might trigger a notification. So in Germany, at least, we and the German legislator continue to think that it is good to have a system where there are certain thresholds. Above these thresholds, there is the obligation to notify. Below the thresholds, there is no obligation to notify, but also no possibility for the competition authority to call in such cases. And that is the reason why Germany and also Austria have introduced this transaction value threshold for the group of high value, low turnover transactions. In Germany, we have also another similar provision aimed at catching small and consecutive mergers, especially on local markets and regional markets. The downside of this approach, of course, is that you get a certain number of cases which are foreseeably and obviously of no competitive issue, and still there is a risk that there are some cases you don't catch. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fabian. It was very interesting to hear your position and the position of the Bundeskartellamt with reference to the Article 22. And let's move now to the last question that is more related to digital markets. We all know that the term killer acquisition has been coined with reference to pharmaceutical markets, but there's a large application also in digital markets. So, Marta, the question that I have for you is, what's beyond killer acquisition in digital markets? Are there more common potential competition issues in those markets, and how can this be assessed?
Thank you, Alessia, and thank you for the invitation, certainly. I think that the digital sector has some key characteristics that can trigger competition concerns, and that make digital markets particularly relevant when discussing acquisitions by incumbents and their incentives to do so. Just to name a few: multi-siteness, strong network effects, large volume of data, lock-in effects, lack of interoperability among many others. And it's this very nature of the digital platforms that can contribute to high market concentration, and markets may tip and generate winner-takes-all outcomes. And this can itself induce firms to adopt harmful strategies to protect their own position in the market. And these strategies apply to exclusionary conduct, but also, I think, to killer acquisitions, because here the motivation is the same. And these occur because there's a high substitutability between the incumbent's product and the product of the target firm, or a likely chance to be the case in the future, like Carmine said, or in other words, if they overlap or expect to overlap in the future. Or we can also have situations where the entrant has a product or a project that, if successful, gives the entrant the ability to launch a new product that challenges the incumbent's position. And I think that some of these incentives, at least those that are related to suppress potential competition, maybe not so much to killer acquisitions, have already been seen, for example, in internal documents from Facebook related to the acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp. Before buying Instagram, Facebook was concerned with Instagram rapidly gaining users, about Facebook users switching to Instagram, and about Google buying Instagram and using it as a stepping stone to pose a threat to Facebook. But the key question here is, how do we detect killer acquisitions or startup acquisitions by large incumbents that may give rise to anti-competitive effects? Well, many avenues have been discussed, and some of those just mentioned. On merger notification thresholds, we have seen these moves towards considering the acquisition value in Germany and Austria, as Fabian explained. In Portugal, we have a combination of market shares and turnover. This means that some mergers with low turnover, but with some significant market share, can be caught, which would not be the case if only a turnover threshold would be considered. And I think this can be particularly relevant in digital mergers, when, for example, the target firm has a substantial user base. So I think, of course, there are some limitations to these solutions, but I think that merger thresholds can provide, at least to a certain extent, some complementary screening devices. Indeed, there are already some examples. Fabian already mentioned one with the Meta customer in Austria. The Apple Shazam and Facebook WhatsApp mergers were also met the legally defined notification thresholds in Spain. The Google Waze and the Facebook Instagram were investigated in the UK. Also, the greater flexibility that has been given to the application of referral mechanism of the EU merger regulation, I think it also has potential and has already proved itself fruitful with the case that was already mentioned here with the Illumina Grail merger decision. This was a below-threshold merger assessed using the new guidelines of Article 22, and the European General Court already upheld this broad interpretation of the Article 22. And this is actually quite an interesting merger. It seems to be from the press release, because it raises concerns on vertical concerns, innovation, and potential competition, which is all the things that can be tricky in merger policy. So I think this shows that merger policy can be more flexible, at least to some extent, without significant changes. But one can also ask if this is enough to capture all startup acquisitions by large firms and that bring competition concerns. For example, are we able to investigate acquisitions of very young firms in which there's no clear indication from the outset they are likely to succeed? According to a Lear report, here I'm citing you, Alessia, if I may, the age of the target firms at the time of acquisition was 4 years or younger in almost 60% of the cases that you have analyzed. More recent empirical evidence suggests that acquisitions of younger firms are more likely for its product or project to be discontinued. And this also, this is more related to digital, but Carmine, you also mentioned that on pharma, this seems also be relevant because based on your last slide, there was a number of the innovation came from younger firms, which seemed to be the case. So these are certainly things that is worth thinking about it. In addition, I think that digital markets are fast evolving. Platforms have access to substantial data about the market, including the profile of their users in real time. And in fact, some of the acquisitions that were made by large platforms were precisely to help them with advanced data analytic techniques. And of course, even though this would be most likely not or wouldn't raise killer acquisitions concerns or even competition concerns, but these acquisitions, they do help firms to monitor market trends and in the future detect in a quicker way potential competitive threats for the platforms and for the ecosystems. Take, for example, the UK Parliamentary Inquiry on Disinformation released some documents, and this is also information that is mentioned in the Australian Digital Inquiry, that Facebook used Ornaghi, a company that they acquired, to conduct global surveys of the usage of mobile apps by customers to help them in their own acquisition strategy. There has also been voices concerning that large platforms may create a kill zone around their areas of activity, and that this can dissuade firms potential firms from entering the market in the first place. Of course, that is, in my view, these concerns are more related to exclusionary conduct and less to killer acquisitions, but one can ask if everyone expects the incumbent to use some kind of exclusionary practice, then would the expectation by itself reduce the number of outside options for an entrant and potentially its acquisition value? And this may, if this is the case, then this may decrease the effectiveness of merger notification thresholds based on the acquisition value, for instance. So I think that we need to act fast in these type of markets. Here, some considerations have already been made in the past that I think they're worth continue discussing in fora like this. Like, for example, the Furman report that on digital mergers proposed to oblige large digital firms to notify all intended acquisitions and also to prioritize the assessment of digital mergers that can raise concerns on innovation and on potential competition. This does not mean that incumbents will not be able to buy small firms, rather that competition authorities would have a say on it. Of course, that this raises other types of issues, for instance, in terms of the number of resources that competition authorities would need to have and this could be definitely an overwhelming task. But I think that to detect and prohibit harmful acquisitions, we also need evidence. We need evidence to back a strong intervention. After all, gut feeling is not enough. And on this point, I think agencies have brought powers to access relevant documentation, and documents can be quite useful, and they can provide highly valuable information. Take, for instance, on the rationale for the merger, on the valuation behind the bidding price of the acquisition, on whether the incumbent sees the target firm as a competitive threat in the future, or if it has a plans to shut it down, on whether the target firm has what it takes to pursue the project by itself, or it can attract alternative buyers. So internal documents can shed some light on this. And on the relevant counterfactual, and this can be even more important when we are dealing with potential competition or firms that target firms that are at a very early stage of development. And to finalize, I think also a better understanding of digital markets can prepare us to quicker and more accurate investigations. And they can provide a further complement, I would say, in detecting with this type of acquisitions. And just to finalize, I think on these, competition agencies are more than ever looking at the digital sector with several market studies and with digital units. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. And we are running out of time, but before closing this session, I'm curious to know whether someone has some question to ask to our speaker. Great.
No question. No. Okay. First question about the pharmaceutical sector. So, very quickly, how do you think you can capture the dynamics? Because we know that research and development in pharmaceutical sector is a pretty long process. You patent a molecule, and then the implementation, the possible adoption as a drug takes a very long time. So, in this way, do you think that there is probably, in some sense, you already mentioned a bias in capturing possible changes, work changes of inventors from a firm to another after the killer acquisition? Also because if you think about, there is a lot of segmentation within drugs. So if you are specialized in a specific drug, maybe you are not able to get to another company to produce another drug, to invent another drug. And one question for the representative of the National Competition Authority about the threshold, the notification thresholds. Do the notification threshold all together? Or are these alternatives? So, for example, you mentioned, Fabian, that for Germany, at least one of the company needs to have a turnover around 50 million, and the other. The cumulative one, the 400 million, has to all together with the other one, or there is some alternative? And also for the Portuguese representative, do you need to have both market shares and threshold, or you can manage independently? Thanks.
Very quickly, yes, I agree. It's very difficult. The advantage for the pharmaceutical industry, and the reason why probably there are more scholars doing that research, is that you can observe a bit what they are doing thanks to clinical trials, thanks to all the drugs that have been approved. So you can measure overlapping, you can observe what happens. Now, yes, what are the effects in terms of incentives? And Marta was talking about it. So it's not really clear. So this small company knows at a certain point that it will be bought, at least or the project or the whole company. Now, it's why it has to be the incumbent to buy it? There is no reason. Why it has to be a firm where there is overlapping that has to buy this small project? No, there is no reason. So yes, let's either block them or put some remedies. But even in the remedy, if I have two projects and I let one of the company to choose and then say, okay, and then the other you have to, you can sell the other project. Why would another company be interested in choosing the second project? I'm talking about overlapping of pipeline. So you have two projects, maybe clearly the company that sells knows better than the potential acquirer. So it's very complex. So even in terms of what the authorities can do once you detect them, it's not clear. And what are then the incentives and the implication in the long run are also not clear. So one thing is to detect them, and then what are the best way to proceed, and it's a question mark. Yes.
I'm not I'm not sure if I got your question correctly, but the traditional turnover-based threshold and the new transaction value-based thresholds are alternatives in the sense that the transaction value threshold applies only when the turnover thresholds are not met. And I think in more than 98% of the cases, the turnover threshold applies, and only in 1 or 2% of the cases, the transaction value threshold applies. The 500 million threshold is a turnover threshold of all the companies involved. And the 400 million threshold is a transaction value threshold. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yes, I think so. In Portugal, the mergers are notifiable if there's a turnover threshold only, a market share threshold only, and then a combination of both. So you have both, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we do not have time for questions because I see people waiting outside for the presentation of the Young Talent Competition Award. I'm really sorry for that. And we can discuss this question, of course, over the aperitif or the coffee break that we are going to have. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thanks a lot to Carmine, Fabian, and Marta.